Hello, people with varying numbers of intact organs. I am Patrick Smith. This is Disenthrall. Today we have special guest Brendon Marotta, who is an award-winning filmmaker who recently released the feature-length documentary American Circumcision, which explores the modern debate around circumcision. Shot over 6 years, the film includes interviews with top experts on both sides and a look at the growing movement which believes all human beings should have the right to keep the body they were born with. Welcome to the show, Brendon.
Thanks for having me on.
So, I was granted access to your screener for this awesome documentary. I was going in, I was really kind of worried that because a lot of like activism or niche documentaries are kind of low quality or amateur. This was absolutely professional. It was, and it's award-winning, right? I want to get into it and play the trailer, but can you really quickly just kind of give us the synopsis and the awards that it's winning?
So the film is titled, like you said, American Circumcision. It's about the modern debate around circumcision. We interview people on both sides. We interview people from the American Academy of Pediatrics and various doctors groups. We interview various activists. The first film festival we played at, the Lone Star Film Festival, we got Best Documentary. And one of the ones we played at might ruffle some feathers with your audience, but we won an award at the Social Justice Film Festival. And so technically you've invited an award-winning social justice activist on your show, but I'll try not to be too triggered by anything.
Oh God. Okay. All right. Fair enough. So
to be fair, though, I've been on Stephen Molyneux's show too, so we talk to people of every perspective.
Yeah. New Molyneux or old Molyneux? How recently? When did this come out?
So it came out this past year at the end of August, and actually next October 12th, we are going to be available worldwide. So we're going to be on international platforms too.
I am so pleased with the quality, like the storytelling. When it starts, you're seeing this baby being strapped into this, I don't know what you call the device that literally holds them down. And then, what was it?
It's called the circumstraint. That is actually what they use, a 4-point restraint that they strap infants down to.
And so I knew at that moment from like the very beginning of the documentary, at some point he's going to show this procedure happening. And I instantly began like feeling this sense of dread and worry, and my stress levels rose. And then you cut away, and then we went to to talk to the people and to interview all the people and to learn all the facts and stuff like that. And then every once in a while, it seemed like you'd pop back to remind us, "Hey, this is coming," and I would be like, "Oh God, here it comes." Fair warning, I guess. Not fair warning. What do you say? It should be known that I have a son, and before I was aware of any of the things that this documentary talks about, I did have my son circumcised, something that I regret very deeply to this day, and why I'm motivated to talk about these topics. So before we get like too far into it, I would like to play the trailer and go from there.
The obsessive epiphany. It's the moment when you realize that there's more here than meets the eye. And you're going deeper and deeper and getting more and more horrified and more angry.
Most of the world is not circumcised. There's no medical society in the world that recommends routine infant circumcision.
There are anti-circumcision groups, the Intactivists.
Intactivism is a worldwide movement
of people who believe that all children have a right to keep the genitals they were born with.
Men ask, why was this forced on me? I mean, it's my body, it should be my choice.
I didn't want the procedure performed at all.
This is a huge activist cause, and we will win.
The benefit to risk ratio of circumcision is 14-1.
So it really is a shame that the rates of the procedure have really declined.
Those who oppose circumcision, they should desist.
Major claims require major proof. When you make a major claim that we doctors can improve upon the human body by removing organs, you've got to show me major proof.
There are a lot of people here that just think, oh, it's a little flap of skin. They don't know that it's being crushed and twisted and then sliced off.
Does that look like a piece of equipment that should be on a baby's penis?
I did them without anesthesia.
They scream, but they scream if they're wet, if they're hungry and so on like that.
It's okay to talk about African mutilation, but this is America. We can't talk about, hurting our young boys.
I'm a multiply orgasmic male, and I get my multiple orgasms from parts of my penis that I would not have if I were circumcised.
If you only knew, foreskin feels really good.
PEPFAR will provide circumcisions for almost 500,000 of boys and men.
Supporters of a circumcision ban have gathered enough signatures to put that measure on the ballot in November.
Anytime that I am at a circumcision, people know something's off.
Not all Jews are for maintaining this tradition.
How did a Jewish ritual become an American custom?
The AAP just entrains us to think it's the parent's choice.
What kind of person are you if you think it's someone's choice to tie a baby down and cut them up?
This is the human rights issue of the 21st century, the American human rights issue.
It permeates so much of our culture, and we don't talk about it.
So good. So good. I'm telling you guys, you got to go see this. And it's not, I saw it on Google Play for like $7. It's not even expensive to go see. It's awesome. Can you tell us where you were on this issue before you began your research, 6 years of work on this documentary? What motivated you to do this work?
So what motivated me to do this work was that I just learned that there was a lot more to this issue than I'd been taught. I think like most Americans, I just sort of thought, well, it's something you do when someone's a baby, and then you never think about it again, and there's nothing you can do about it, and that's it. I went through a period in my life where I was kind of letting go a lot of early childhood experiences and beliefs and patterns I'd been given that didn't serve me anymore. And as I was doing that, I was reading a lot about early life psychology. I was reading about how things that happen to you in childhood affect you later on. And I ran across this issue of circumcision, and I thought, well, that's kind of weird. It makes me feel a little uncomfortable. I don't like things that I can't control, and it seems like there's nothing I can do about that. So why think about it? I just sort of pushed it out of my mind. But at the time, it was practicing meditation. And in meditation, you just be present with whatever's there. The way that I practice, there's nothing mystical about it. It's just you sit, and whatever thoughts come in your mind, you just watch them and be present with them. And so as I was doing this, I had the word circumcision come into my mind. And I felt this really uncomfortable sensation in the body with it. And it happened a couple times during meditation. So I just sort of thought, okay, well, some part of my consciousness wants me to look at this. So I'm going to actually do the research. I'm not going to push it out of my mind when it comes up. And when I did, I started researching, and I found out a lot of the information that's in the film now. I found out also about something called foreskin restoration, where men, you can't get the full foreskin back, but they stretch the remaining skin over time to try to get a covering for that part of the body. And I thought, okay, well, my whole life I've been told there's nothing you can do about this. Clearly there's something that people are doing. What else have I not been told about this issue? And when I started researching, I found that instead of it being a one-time decision that parents make and never think about again, it's more like throwing a stone in a pond. It's something that ripples out through that man's life, through his sexuality, through his self-image, his psychology, his body, through his relationships, through the, intimate partners that he has, through cultural institutions, even things like law and government. And when I started seeing that, I thought, there's a lot more here than I've been told. And so I think going into it, I really just had the idea that this is a bigger story than most people are aware. And that's always been my frame when working on the issue, and it's always been my frame with the film. In the film, we don't take a particular side. We don't tell the audience they have to think one way or the other. But just the idea that there's more to this issue than you've been told. And that if you're willing to look at it, you can actually learn a lot and maybe even do something that will improve your life and the life of your future children.
It's something that no parent of a male child can be neutral on. Even you make the decision one way or another. You decide to leave it alone, or you tell the doctors, you give the doctors consent to do the procedure. You've taken a position one way or another. And that, I think, leads parents to have a lot of sunk cost bias, which is whatever decision you made, you sort of have to stand by, because if you got it done, if you had the procedure done, then if you don't stand by that, then it's kind of to admit that you assaulted your son, that you did some pretty terrible things to your little kid. And that's really uncomfortable to sit with as a parent. I can tell you from experience. I mean, it is visceral. It's very difficult to admit when you've done wrong.
We talk about that in the film, and there's actually an entire community of what are called regret parents who feel like they made the wrong decision, because when doctors get, consent, informed consent on circumcision, they simply say, "Would you like your child circumcised?" They don't give any information beyond that. Often parents don't even know circumcision removes skin. There's one moment in the beginning of the film where there's an elderly man who approaches some of the protesters and says, "Does circumcision remove something? I thought it was just an incision." And this man's in his 60s, and he's not aware that a part of his body's been removed. There's that much ignorance of like his own body and what's happened to him. So, doctors are on most procedures are required to give what's called informed consent, meaning what would any reasonable person want to know about the procedure? So if you're going to get surgery, the doctor will tell you these are the risks, here's what could go wrong, here's the reasons we might do it, here's the potential side effects. On circumcision, it's just, would you like it done? And so a lot of parents feel really duped by that. And then they learn information later and go, wow, that is not the decision I would have made then if I knew what I knew now.
And it's on the parent to do the research before they have things done. So I don't absolve parents, but I don't absolve myself, but I understand. I completely understand. I was there, and I am circumcised, and I talk a lot about on the show. It's like a reoccurring theme where we accept the reality that we're presented with when we enter the world. And if we grow up never having had a foreskin, then it's normal. There is no other reality. And if we don't come in contact with a lot of other male genitalia, then we don't even know that there's something different or that we're missing something. It would be like if we were blind in one eye and never realized that everyone else wasn't blind in one eye. We just assumed that depth perception wasn't a thing. It would be difficult to understand what exactly we were missing. And so to say that, oh, I'm fine, I was circumcised and I'm fine, my life is fine. Maybe not. Maybe you need to sit with yourself and spend some time considering how things might have been different, or what sensations or abilities or capacities you don't have that other people do because this was done.
I think there's also a challenge there for men of what would it mean if you weren't fine? Like how would that change your perception of yourself? Like, is it okay for you to not be okay? For men, I think that there is a huge pressure never to complain about anything, and to always, men gain social capital and value by being willing to sacrifice their well-being for the good of the tribe. So if a man is willing to charge into battle, or become something like a police officer, or a firefighter, or work long hours and sacrifice his health and time to make money, that's how he gains value in society. And so if you say, well, I'm not okay with something, I'm not fine, I'm not capable of doing this role that society has given me, then there's going to be a lot of pressure from outside and a lot of voices telling you that it's not okay to not be okay. So I think that that's a huge pressure for men.
What you just said is extremely powerful. It's there's three untouchable authorities in the world that I always talk about: government, God, and family. And this touches on the family one. That is kind of one of the rarer ones to touch on, right? It
touches on all three.
That is true. Maybe we can get into that. But for the family one, like how uncomfortable is it for people to place blame on family members or parents? Like that's something that's very rare and very uncomfortable to do, right? To hold them to account.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, you have to make a public statement on this issue. You have to be willing to confront your family and tell them that something that they did was wrong, while also talking publicly about your sexuality, which is, again, like, I joke that this issue is all the most taboo things in our culture in the most personal way possible. So it is sex, politics, religion, as you said, government, family, and God, all revolving around your body and the most personal part of your body. So it is an incredibly difficult issue for anyone to talk about. And then when people don't talk about it, they'll say, well, men seem fine with it. They're not complaining. But if you do complain, they say you're weak. There's something wrong with you. There's the potential for your family to disown you. I mean, I do know people who have stopped talking to their family over this issue. So it's incredibly difficult. And I think that part of the reason this issue is finally coming to the surface and it's finally being something people talk about publicly is that there's already many other taboo issues we've become okay as a culture talking about. And now we have the platforms to talk about those issues on.
I mean, it's a powerful thing. I'll look in the camera right now. I know my mother's going to watch this. Mom, you messed up. You did wrong. You did something to me that you shouldn't have. And I fully expect to have that exact same conversation with my son. And I deserve it. And by speaking out on this, I hope to break the chain so that it stops happening in my family line. That's a hard thing to do. Sorry.
You know,
yeah, go ahead.
That phrasing, that's really powerful. And I want to acknowledge you for that, because what you just did, you know, I mentioned that there is a way where men are socially rewarded for sacrificing their own well-being for the good of the tribe. And there is a way in which what you just did was sacrificing a part of your emotional comfort and well-being for the good of the tribe and for the good of your future children and your family. But because most of the world doesn't understand this issue, they won't acknowledge what you just did as bravery.
No, they'll think I'm persecuting my parents. and how dare I question my parents' decisions.
Right. Why are you doing this to me? Yeah.
Yeah, they were just doing what they thought was best, or what they were even told by the doctors whom they trusted was the best. You know, there's all sorts of reasons for that. And well, we can get into that. Doctors take an oath to do no harm, and this was brought up in your documentary. Can you speak a little bit to that? How they absolve themselves of the obvious harm that this is doing to people?
So, from their perspective, they believe that what they're doing is for the good of the child. So, you've probably heard that phrase in parenting, for your own good. This is their perspective on it. It's essentially that they believe that the benefits outweigh the risks, and that by removing this part of the body, they are preventing a lot of future diseases. They compare it to vaccinations or immunizations. And when you talk to OBs and pediatricians and people who do the procedure about the consent issue, about the fact that the child does not consent to this, they will say, well, the mother is my patient, and this is a service that we perform for the family and the mother. So there's a way in which they sort of have it both ways. They're doing it for the good of the child, but they're also doing it because the parents ask for it. And when you get into it, the ethics get a little murky, but that is sort of their general position, is that this is somehow beneficial for the child. And, you know, it's sort of like when you get into it, it's sort of a strange frame. It's the idea that this one part of your body is going to try to kill you unless you cut it off first. We just have to it's this sort of weird frame that your penis is trying to kill you, and you have to just get rid of part of it. When you get into it in that frame, it sounds sort of ridiculous, but that at the same time, they frame that part of the body differently than they do any other. So you wouldn't talk about well, could I prevent ear infections by removing my ear, or prevent nose infections by removing my nose? You sort of acknowledge that the sensory function and the perceptual function of that part of the body is important and it has value, and that removing it would reduce that sensation and ability to perceive the world. But they also don't acknowledge that there's any sensory benefit to the foreskin, which is a whole other topic.
Yeah, that's a whole other problem. Yeah, so there are people in the intactivist movement, let's say, that make it very difficult to take it seriously by exaggerating the problems that it causes far beyond, reasonable discourse. But there are also incredibly negative effects that can come out of this that are far outside of what a normal person would think is in the realm of possibility for circumcising a boy, up to and including death in certain circumstances from infection. So there are permanent effects that range from minor things to permanent things, right? And again, because we accept the reality that we're presented with, you will not necessarily associate those permanent effects with what was done. I know that was the case in my case. I have some negative effects. I won't get into any specifics at all. They are on the more minor side, but I would have never thought as to what the cause of them would have been until I heard about all of this information, until I heard about this activism, until I started looking at the data, the information, the science behind it, and looking at the lists of literal problems and effects and negatives that can come out of this procedure. And I said, oh, that's that thing on that list, that's on my list. That's important to know and acknowledge. Can you talk about permanent effects and that vaccination study that I think came up in the documentary?
Yeah, I can get into that. I also want to address the thing you mentioned at the beginning about how some activists exaggerate the claims. And I think that comes from the fact that a lot of the people who do activism on this issue are not professional activists in any way. They are not spokespeople. They have no background in activism. They're parents and young men and doctors and nurses and people who just learn about this and feel harmed by it. And some of them feel so harmed by it that they want others to acknowledge their harm. And it's really difficult. It's really difficult if you feel harmed by something to have everyone in your community, everyone around you, everyone who supposedly loves and cares about you, invalidating what you feel. Yeah. And because our culture doesn't really acknowledge emotional harm, like if I told you that when I was a child, someone touched my genitals in a way that I didn't consent to, and I felt deep emotional harm over that, and I really felt traumatized by that, I think most reasonable people would acknowledge that as valid. But if I tell you that while they did that, they cut off part of my genitals, and it was a procedure paid for by my parents, and I used the euphemism of circumcision, people would say, well, that's nothing, it's a little snip, you have no right to feel that way.
Wow.
So when you get that emotional invalidation, it makes people really angry, and I think that people in response to that will reach to claims that seem more objective. So they will say that this procedure caused all sorts of things for them that maybe they couldn't prove in a controlled study, because that's how big it affects them emotionally. Now, on the topic of controlled studies, though, there are some things that we can go to. And one of them is the Taddeo pain studies, which is the one you were asking about specifically.
Yeah.
So they did a study where they were vaccinating children, and they were studying how the children reacted to the pain of vaccination. And they found that one group of children reacted really dramatically to the pain. They just, much more... much bigger an emotional reaction to having this needle go into them for a vaccine. And so they were trying to figure out, why are the children reacting this way? Was it, were they breastfed versus bottle fed? Were they held to a certain amount or not enough? And what they found was that it was the children who'd been circumcised who had this dramatic reaction to the pain. And the researchers attributed that to PTSD. So the children had this very painful experience of circumcision. And circumcision until the mid-'80s was done without anesthesia because it was believed babies couldn't feel pain. So imagine someone cutting into the genitals of a child with no anesthesia. I mean, children's lungs have been harmed and burst from how much they scream during this. It's really intense. And yeah, I think the reaction you are having now is what I think most people would have to that. But doctors just thought, well, they can't remember the pain, so it's fine, we'll just get over it. But what this study showed is that there is a change in behavior from the pain that infants feel. And a change in behavior is a form of memory. Now, a lot of people get really upset about that because they say, well, you can't remember your circumcision. That seems ridiculous, even though there is a scientific study that everyone on the topic acknowledges is valid. They'll say, well, you can't remember that because, I don't remember anything from when I was a kid. And you may not remember it in what we might call narrative memory. You won't remember it like if I asked you what you had for breakfast yesterday. But you remember it in somatic memory, which is like the body remembering things. Most animals really only have somatic memory. So like if you were to beat your dog and then you were to raise your fist, your dog would flinch because it would remember, oh, I'm about to be hurt. And if you come home and you're really nice to your dog, every time you come home, your dog is happy to see you. It's like wagging its tail, it's so happy. So your dog has somatic memory. It remembers things on that level, even though your dog couldn't tell you a story about its life. But I also feel like, if someone were to beat their dog and say, well, he won't remember it, you would think that person's kind of a monster. Yet that's the attitude that we took towards infants throughout most of the time circumcision has been done. And now there are scientific studies that show that there is a lasting change in behavior from circumcision, which the researchers attribute to post-traumatic stress.
And it really makes a lot of sense. It's not an outlandish claim. Everything you do to a child from the moment they're conceived until they're adults or whatever has an effect on their body, on their physiology, and their brain wiring. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that talks
about that. Yeah.
Oh, you have? Okay, yeah. It talks about the physiological changes that go on into the brain caused by PTSD, primarily in soldiers and things like that, but it also relates the physiological changes from other forms of traumatic stress, like this one. Another example I think a lot of people overlook is the sleep training stuff that got really popular there for a while, where the right way to train your baby to sleep on their own is to basically put them in a crib, turn the lights off, walk out of the room and shut the door, and basically leave them in a dark room by themselves for a while to scream until they finally tire themselves out and fall asleep. Every decision you make has an effect, a physiological effect, especially at that age. And the younger they are, the more you alter their life trajectory. The easier it is to alter their life trajectory with decisions like this. I wanted to also talk about the sunk cost bias that doctors have at this point in continuing to support this procedure. So they've endorsed it for so long and for so many years, and some of these guys have performed this procedure so many times. And like the pain that I feel retroactively about the decision I made, I can't even imagine the emotional trauma that I would have to work through in myself if I had carried out that procedure on thousands of babies. That would be an almost insurmountable thing to ask a person to get over. So anyway, do you have any thoughts on that? It seems like there has to be a clear bias of doctors.
That is certainly huge. And doctors will tell you that they are objective, rational, purely scientific about this issue, ignoring all the research that exists on cognitive bias in human psychology, which suggests that no one is completely rational about something they have a strong emotional feeling about, or that they do, or that they have a financial incentive for, or that they have some part of their self-identity wrapped in. I mean, the idea that no one is perfectly rational. It's sort of absurd for them to even suggest that. And when you get into it, there is an identity level issue that comes up for doctors if they've done this. Because if they have done something that they later find out is wrong, well, what does that reflect about them?
Yeah.
Like, how does that change their self-image? There's also the financial implications. If doctors groups were to say that this procedure that they've done for close to 100 years now was wrong and in some way harmful to their patients, they would open themselves up to massive legal liability. So every circumcised man in the country might suddenly potentially have a lawsuit, and it would have significant financial consequences for them, which is why I think most, the American doctors group that deals the most with this issue, the American Academy of Pediatrics, I think that's why their position has always kind of tried to be on the fence, where they say, well, there's not enough benefits to recommend it, or to say that everyone should do it, but there's not enough risks to say that we shouldn't do it, so we're just going to let the parents decide.
It's part of the problem of getting politics involved in medicine, right? Yeah.
There's a whole series. Yeah, that's a whole separate documentary if you want to go into that.
Yeah, totally. So I have a list here of reasons to circumcise. And you did a really cool montage in your documentary where you showed over the years how they've just moved the goalposts, how they've changed from one reason to do it to the next, to the next, to the next. First, they literally thought it helped cure epilepsy, or prevent epilepsy, I should say. Then masturbation was a real problem. And so, if you circumcise, if you cut off part of the penis, then masturbation becomes less pleasurable, which, has to be an admission of the actual damage of the circumcision act, right? Then it was clubfoot. Somehow circumcision affected clubfoot. Then diarrhea. It prevented diarrhea. Sexual immorality was the next big thing that circumcision prevented. Then penile cancer. Now we're starting to get a little bit more serious. Venereal disease, cervical cancer. Trying to think how circumcision would prevent cervical cancer in women.
Yeah, their theory is that it's transmitted from the partner. If it's transmission rates are less from circumcised men, is their theory.
Transmission rates of
that the women who have circumcised partners are less likely to get cervical cancer. This is a statistical correlation they did. Never mind that there might be, economic or biological differences that might also impact that in some way. That's a whole other topic.
So then it's STDs, then it's UTI, and now the current one is AIDS. It reduces your ability, or I guess your chance of contracting AIDS. I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. There was some stuff going on in Africa. I think your documentary covered some studies that were happening over there and what was wrong with those studies. And can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So when most people hear about those studies, they hear a headline that says circumcision prevents HIV. And they go, well, that's good because I don't want to get HIV. And if most American men are circumcised. So they read that, they move on. And they don't get into the studies, they don't get into all the stuff. And that's part of the challenge with these claims is that they're a headline and circumcision prevents this. And you go, great, that sounds good. And then when you get into the academic literature, when you actually read the studies, there's a lot of questions that are brought up. So on that one, first of all, even the studies claim circumcision prevents HIV. Part of the challenge of this is that the first version of the sequence looking at those studies was over an hour long because you could spend that long going into every statistical thing.
Yeah.
But there are also studies that suggest that female circumcision reduces HIV. And yet
we can't talk about that. We can't talk about that.
Right. But on those, we understand that women have the right to their own bodies. And even if it did that women should be able to have the right to make their own choice. So I want to preface it with that. But when you get into the studies, I'll try to go quickly through this. There's so much to cover here. First of all, 60% was the reduction rate they give. That's the relative risk reduction. The absolute is closer to around 1%. So if I am inside, I might say that my risk of being hit by a meteorite is 600% less. But my absolute risk of that happening is probably pretty low, right? So there's a way that you can play with statistics that way and make something sound a lot better than it is. And then when you get into the studies, more men left the study than stayed in it. The men who were in the study were offered, these studies were conducted in Africa, first of all. So they may not even be applicable to the United States because the HIV situation over there is very different. And in fact, some experts I interviewed who were pro-circumcision said, well, HIV in America is primarily spread through intravenous drug use and sex between men, and so that doesn't really have, a study done on a population where it's spreading through heterosexual sex doesn't really have any application to things here. But then you get into it, the people in the study were offered a significant amount of money to be in it, which immediately, you could not ethically do that study in the United States, but you can in Africa. The study found that men who were circumcised were more likely to give HIV to female partners. So it only protects the man. It does not protect his female partner. He's more likely to transmit it to her. So there's a chance that the circumcision programs they're rolling out in Africa could increase the rate of AIDS there. A small chance that they're gambling, 40 million tax dollars on. When you get into it, it gets, you get into statistics too. There are, there's even, it would really take me an hour to go through all the data.
That's fine.
But that's the problem is you read the headline and you're like, well, that sounds really good. And then you get into it and it's like, this study is a mess. There's a whole series of statistical errors there, and at the same time, it doesn't even apply to America. And at the same time, we're doing it to babies who aren't having sex.
We did an episode recently. You guys can go back probably a month or two and find it on statistics, where we started with a headline and we brought an actual professional statistician on the show, and we drilled down through the headline to the claims, to the studies, to the data behind the studies, and we showed, even with a study that wasn't messed up like the one that you're describing, how absolutely difficult it is to derive a conclusive truth statement headline from one of these scientific studies. I would invite everybody to go check out that episode. It's a little dry because it's statistics, but it will show you the rabbit hole that you have to go into with this stuff. Okay, so one of the things that really hit home for me in the documentary was there was a lady on kind of towards later on where I think she was from Africa, correct me if I'm wrong, but she had witnessed a female circumcision take place. And then she had come to America, lives in America, and then witnessed a male circumcision take place. And she basically said, guys, this is dumb. This is the same thing. Stop it. That was a really powerful message.
Yeah, the woman you're mentioning is Soraya Mire, who she did a documentary on female genital cutting. She also helped get laws in the United States passed against female genital cutting. And she is an incredible woman. She's an incredibly powerful advocate. But when she saw, what she's basically said is that pain is pain for children. There's not a different kind of pain that a male child feels different than a female child. And that she is an advocate for all children. So she can't tell one side, I don't hear your pain. And there's a lot of circumcised African women who have said the same thing. And part of the problem is that the organizations that advocate against female genital cutting are run by wealthy Westerners who have their cultural biases coming from a culture that circumcises men. So when you talk to women who have experienced both, many of them will tell you that they are the same. In fact, one woman, Arian Hershey Ali, has said that male circumcision is more detrimental than female circumcision. And there are a few circumcised women who will argue this case as well. But at the core experience, again, as the interview subject I mentioned, Soraya said, the first cut is where the human rights violation is. It's not like, you can cut off this much of my hand and then it's not a human rights violation. But if you cut off the whole wrist, then it's a human rights violation. It's my freedom ends where your body begins.
Absolutely. And I mean, parents have a responsibility to ensure the safety of their children. Parents have a responsibility. I like to say it like this. Parents have a responsibility to the future adult version of their child to deliver unto that adult a healthy, intact, happy, well-balanced, not mentally damaged person. And to the degree to which you cannot use force and forceful interaction with your kid is the degree I think you're doing it right. Now, certainly there are situations where a bad thing is about to happen in an emergency that you couldn't prepare for, and you have to step in and use physical force to prevent immediate harm and damage to your kid. Of course, yeah, sure. Only in those circumstances. The way I think about it is like only if I could have a conversation with the future adult version of my child and explain to him and justify my force that I use upon him, should that be okay? And it's like up to his future approval. And if he decides in the future that what I did was wrong and a violation of his bodily integrity and property, then I'm culpable for that crime. And I think one of the things that's changing in this area, in many areas, but in this area specifically, is that parents are beginning to be held to account. And it's and challenging that one of those three unquestionable authorities and speaking back to parents, that will change society on this issue faster than anything else. I'd like to go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things that people who argue for circumcision say is they frame it as a parental choice. This is the right of the parent to choose. And I find the way that you frame that really interesting because when people call it a parental choice, they don't ever think about the fact that their child might come back to them later and question that choice. And that the choices that they make are going to have an impact on their future relationship with their child. They sort of say, well, I'll make this decision and he'll just have to live with it. Not realizing they're still going to know that child when he's 11 and when he's 15 and when he's 18 and when he's 32 and when he's 40. Like these decisions are something that your child will have a conversation with you about at some point.
And to make bad decisions in this area is to bank on that third superstition. Like 100 years ago, you were, raised in an alcoholic household where your parent beat you, and you grew up and you became an adult and you started telling people, hey, my dad beat me and he was drunk all the time. People would be like, well, it's your dad. You can't question that. He's your dad. You got to love him and continue supporting him. And, you can't just leave that relationship. That's changing. And people are growing up and they're saying, hey, why did you make that decision with me and my body when you were raising me?
It's also to bank on the idea that the culture won't change. So think about how different the world was 18 years ago, right? That would be the year 2000. It's a very different world now. There's a huge shift that's happened across all sorts of cultural norms, across technology. And so how much do you think it's going to shift in another 18 years? And how much do you think it's going to shift on this issue as information becomes more widely available?
Because that's all it takes.
Right, yeah.
All it takes is people telling people, hey, that thing that happened to you that you just accepted as part of reality, that was wrong. There's probably some negative effects. You should probably go get it checked out. That's all it takes. And then boom, culpability for the parents. You got to be careful. You got to make good decisions. Very good. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about was your experience, your outlook on life, your outlook on this issue. You spent 6 years on this topic, so you're probably far more expert on it than 99% of the population or more. Did it change your mind? Where are you on this issue now? Would you circumcise a male child of yours?
I think it's pretty easy to guess my answer to the last question, but I want to talk about the larger change that happened when I was working on this, which was, I think I went into it thinking, I'll just share this information with people and then they'll change their perspective and that'll be it. I just sort of assume people are rational and they'll hear this and then they'll shift, because that's what rational people do. You update your perspective when you get new information, right? Right. But what I found, of course, was that that's not the case. And I think that this issue has been an incredible way to explore human psychology and explore why people make the decisions they make, to explore the things you talk about sunk cost, or our taboos, or cognitive dissonance. And so what this has done, I feel like the film, on the one hand, really teaches you, everything you'd want to know about the issue of circumcision. And it is the informed consent on this issue. And at the same time, it also teaches a lot about human nature, about the human experience, about how people perceive the world. Because when you get into something that touches on all of those identity level issues, you also get to explore how people relate to their identity and all those issues. That is the biggest change it has made in me, is that it's made me very curious about human consciousness and a lot more knowledgeable on that subject.
And anytime you question these fundamental beliefs that people hold, you get these visceral reactions that would at first feel like personal attacks, or, oh man, what did I do or say wrong? What's wrong with me that caused this reaction? When really people are just, you're seeing their truth. They're giving you their damage. They're evidencing.
Right. Yeah, if I say that there are people who are questioning circumcision or not okay with the fact they were circumcised, not even saying that I feel that way, I just say there are people in the world who feel that way. I can see the chain of events that go through someone's mind where they go, well, I'm circumcised. And if that's bad, then it means something bad happened to me, but that circumcision is part of my identity. So that means I'm bad, and I'm not bad. That's like an attack on my ego and my self-identity. So since I know I'm not bad and I don't want to feel like I'm bad, then you must be bad.
Yes.
And then like this attack will come out and you're like, I was just telling you some information about things going on in the world. Like, what's this about? And I think that there's a leap that's made there unconsciously where someone perceives circumcision as a part of their identity rather than a thing that happened to them. It's interesting. I think people do perceive something like vaccines or the type of birth they had. Like, that's just the thing that happened. But circumcision, because it's permanent, because it leaves a mark, because it becomes part of the body, people perceive as part of them rather than a thing that happened to them. And if they were to perceive it just as a thing that happened to them, then the part of their identity that thinks that human beings should be able to make their own choices about their bodies might be the more dominant part when thinking about this issue.
And because it happened before their memory was recording a timeline. It's just always been like that. That's how my penis has always looked.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Where can I'm going to have obviously links in the description to where people can see your documentary. Do you have any other links or places people should go to find out more about you and your work?
So circumcisionmovie.com is the place for the film. There are links to get the film there. There's all sorts of good trailers and media and good stuff. We are at CircMovie on all social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can find me at BD Marotta, which is my last name, Marotta, and at BrendonMarotta.com.
Sir, I appreciate you coming on the show to talk about your documentary. I appreciate far more than that the fact that you took 6 years of your life to create this documentary. It is definitely, as somebody said in that trailer, one of the prominent human rights issues of our time. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I hope to talk to you again in the future. Let us know what you do in the future.
Will do. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey guys, real quick, I wanted to make sure that people are aware that it exists. We do after shows to many of our interviews, and this one is no exception. I think it was over 20 minutes of really cool conversation on stuff that we didn't get to in the main interview, topics that were not related to circumcision at all, what he's going to be working on next, how to produce and script and compose documentaries, just all kinds of really cool stuff. So that is available to our Patreon supporters. Go check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Disenthrall.